Hi everyone! In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played by Geza Maroczy and Akiba Rubinstein. Both are two very strong players of the 20th century, and this game was played in the 1908 International Masters Tournament in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. And without further ado, let's look at this game. Maroczy starts the game with e4, and now e6 by Rubinstein, the French defense. d4, d5, and now Maroczy plays e takes d5, so the exchange variation of the French. E takes d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop d6, a pretty symmetrical position. Both sides castle, and now bishop g5, so pinning the knight, and Rubinstein does the same thing. And now knight c3. And here you cannot retain the symmetrical position, because if you play knight c6 here, then there's bishop takes f6, and you have two options. You can give up a pawn, or you can play g takes f6. After knight takes d5, you can win the pawn back with bishop takes h2 check, and after king takes h2, queen takes d5. But your pawn structure is a bit crumpled here as black, and obviously this would be way better for white. And you could just give up the pawn and maintain your perfect pawn structure with queen takes f6, but after knight takes d5, white can easily consolidate with the move c3, and he'll have a better position. Therefore, Rubinstein did not go for knight c6, but rather he played c6, just defending the pawn. h3 by Maroczy, kicking the bishop on g4 away, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, and now knight e5. g4 is not really a move you'd see nowadays, as many people would not try to push the pawns in front of their king, as it does weaken the king's defenses. But it's not really easy for Rubinstein to find a way to attack Maroczy. Bishop e7, trying to make sure that the knight on f6 is no longer pinned. The knight on e5 was actually a pretty strong piece for white, and removing it would be very optimal for black. But he can't do it at the moment, since his knight is pinned here. So after d takes e5, he'd just be losing a piece. So therefore, bishop e7. So now Rubinstein is getting ready to play this knight to d7 move, and then, of course, he's just going to get rid of the knight. So f4 by Maroczy. He's trying to play f5 and trap the bishop on g6. So Rubinstein exchanges. And now knight bd7. So he wants to get rid of the e5 knight. Rook ae1, and although Rubinstein could exchange the knights, he instead decides to play rook e8. First getting the f8 square for his bishop. And now rook e2. So Maroczy wants to double his rooks on the e file, and Rubinstein now plays knight takes e5. And now f takes e5 by Maroczy. So Maroczy has closed the e file down. That is true, but he has opened the f file up, and the f file is going to be used by all of Maroczy's pieces. So knight d7, bishop c1, and now knight f8. Knight d1, Maroczy is just trying to reposition his pieces. c5, c3, and now rook c8. And here, if Maroczy isn't careful and he just plays a slow move, like a3, then c takes d4 could be fatal, as this simply wins a pawn, but it's a pretty good pawn to get rid of, since it was a central pawn, and the better thing about playing c takes d4 is that white can't capture either way. If you play c takes d4, then the bishop on c1 is hanging, and if you play queen takes d4, then simply bishop c5 and your queen is lost. So Maroczy has to be a bit careful, and he plays bishop e3. Now if c takes d4 is played, he's most likely going to play bishop takes d4, and that is what happened. Bishop c5, and now knight e3. Knight e3 is just trying to get the knight into this very active f5 square. From there, it can be doing lots of things. It can go to d6. It can be eyeing the g7 pawn as well. So the knight does have a very good future on the f5 square. Knight g6, and now queen f5. Although I just mentioned that knight f5 was a good move, Maroczy has to play it at the right time. If he were to play knight f5 right now, then this would lose him a pawn. Knight takes e5, and now you're simply down a pawn. You can't play rook takes e5 because rook takes e5 and the bishop on d4 is pinned. And if you try bishop takes c5, let's say rook takes c5, trying to go for a tactic, queen d4, then Rubinstein can just defend both rooks with queen c7, and this is obviously a way better position for Rubinstein. So therefore, Maroczy didn't play knight f5 immediately, but rather he played queen f5. So attacking the f7 pawn. Rubinstein here played rook c7, and although Maroczy can win a pawn with bishop takes c5, after rook takes c5, queen takes f7 check, king h8, the e5 pawn is quite weak. So despite the fact that Rubinstein would lose a pawn, he would basically just get it back after something like rook takes e5 or even knight takes e5. So therefore, Maroczy didn't go for bishop takes c5, but rather he just played rook fe1, so doubling the rooks on the e-file, and is getting ready to maybe reinforce his e5 pawn by just moving his knight somewhere to g2. And now, bishop to b6 by Rubinstein. He plays bishop to b6 with the idea of trying to trade the bishops on the b6 square, and then get his queen or rook to the a-file, and then have an overwhelming control over that a-file. So bishop takes b6, a takes b6, and now knight c2. Maroczy wants to get his knight into the critical d4 square, which would blockade the d5 pawn, which is also an isolated queen pawn, and then after that, Maroczy would have a very easy time getting rid of that d5 pawn. So rook c e7, Rubinstein is trying to put pressure on the e5 pawn, knight d4, queen b8, and now knight f3. So Maroczy defends it. f6. This is a mistake. Perhaps if Rubinstein had played something like h6 and just waited, this would be an okay position. But there is the problem of e6, which attempts to open up more lines to Rubinstein's king. A better approach could also have been knight to f8, just simply guarding the e6 square, but that would allow moves like knight g5, and the initiative would certainly go to Maroczy. So this kind of left Rubinstein without any option, and he played f6. And although it looks like it's winning a pawn, it isn't. In fact, it's actually losing a pawn for Rubinstein. So I encourage you to pause the video and try finding the way that Maroczy wins a pawn here. Okay, so the correct move is actually e takes f6, which I believe many people would not play, as it looks like it just gives up the rook. But Rubinstein can't just take this rook, because if rook takes e2, then you're not going to take the rook, that would be losing, but you're going to play f7 check. And now, if you play king to f8, then you will simply grab the rook, you'll queen, and you have no other option but to take the queen with your king. And now, after the simple rook takes e2, white is up a rook. So that's not an option, but you could play king to h8, and after f takes e8, you will take with the rook. And after rook takes e8 check, queen takes e8. This is an equal position, and after king f2, both sides have equal chances. But because of the isolated d-pawn, this would give Maroczy a slight advantage, and he could use this to essentially win the game. Therefore, Rubinstein did not take the rook on e2, but rather he just played queen g3 check, just getting counterplay for himself. And the king goes to f1. And here, Rubinstein takes the pawn on h3, king f2, and now he exchanges all the rooks. So it's a queen and knight endgame, and Rubinstein has to deal with the f6 pawn. He has to capture it. So he captured it, and after g takes f6, Maroczy plays queen takes d5 check. Queen c8 check also looks like a good option, but after queen c8, knight will just block. And now Rubinstein will take the g4 pawn, and he can get some counterplay. He has a passed h-pawn, so that pawn will just run down the board like that. So instead of playing queen to c8 check, queen takes d5 was played. king g7, queen takes b7 check. And here, Rubinstein makes a mistake. It is hard to find a move in this position since Rubinstein has just lost another pawn, and if he's not careful, he's even going to lose more pawns than this. He'll lose this pawn, he can lose the pawn on f6. But had he played the move king to h8, he could have just secured a attempt to get some counterplay with queen g2, knight f4. And when the knight comes into f4, it's going to be a very good position for Rubinstein. He will get lots of counterplay, and despite the fact that he would be down 2 pawns, he would be able to either get a draw or perhaps find a way to even draw the king to an unfavorable square. Unfortunately, he played king h6, and this was a bad move, because Maroczy has a very nice tactical simplification. So I encourage you all to pause the video and try finding this. Okay, so the correct move is g5 check. And at first this doesn't look like a good move because it's simply giving up a pawn. But once you understand the main reason for this, g5 check makes sense. So f takes g5 was played. If you play king h5, then after simply queen takes h7 check, this is lost. After king h3, queen takes h3 check. You shouldn't capture the knight, as after queen takes g6, there is queen takes f3 check as an option. So just queen takes h3, and after king takes h3, g takes f6 is going to be played. And you have 3 extra pawns, and this is an easily winning position for Maroczy. So king h5 is not an option, therefore f takes g5 is played. But this is also losing. And queen takes h7 check immediately ensures that white is not going to lose this game. Because here, you have to take the queen. But now knight takes g5 check. And this is simply over for black. He has to play something like king h6. And after knight takes h3, white is up 2 pawns. He will simply march his king over to a square like b5. Eventually put a lot of pressure on this b6 pawn. Maybe he'll even pick it up with something like knight f2, knight to e4, knight to d2, and then knight c4, and then he will finally pick the pawn up, and, well, that'll end up way better for Maroczy. So therefore, after queen takes h7 check, Maroczy won the game. And this was quite a good game. I mean, the last move was what I like about this game, of how Maroczy found that nice way to simplify the position and also make sure that Rubinstein doesn't get any counterplay. I was mentioning that this h7 pawn could be a good source of counterplay for Rubinstein, but now when g5 check is played, he removes both pawns from the king side, and with his 3-1 majority on the queen side, this is obviously a winning position for Maroczy. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.